was in the United States Air Force stationed in Omaha in the late 80s. At the time, I hung with my roommate and another friend. My name is Tracy, and my roommate's name is also Tracy. The girl we hung out with was named Stacy. When we were together, everyone always thought we were lying and being silly teenagers we were. We always found it funny. One weekend, we decided to take a road trip to Kansas City, Missouri. We were speeding down the highway, laughing and singing at the top of our lungs. We were happy and having the time of our lives. Stacy was driving and she had a bit of a lead foot. She must have been going too fast because before long a state trooper pulled up behind us and turned on his lights. Stacy immediately pulled over. By the time the officer made it to her window, she already had her license and registration in hand and the window down. The officer looked at her and then looked at me and Tracy. He then said, "I want you to follow me. Don't try to run off or y'all will be going to jail." He then turned, walked back to his car and got in it. Needless to say, the three of us were puzzled and talking amongst ourselves, wondering why he just didn't take Stacy's ID and write her a ticket. The officer pulled out slowly and we dropped in behind him. We followed him down the road. He drove a few miles then exited the highway. He drove a little ways and turned onto a dirt road that was surrounded by stalks of corn. We all stopped talking as we became more alarmed. However, being young, scared, and since he was a police officer, we continued to follow him. The officer drove for some time down this dirt road and then pulled into an area that had a big beat-up old barn. As he stopped and we stopped behind him, a group of men with shotguns exited the barn. It wasn't until that point did we realize we were in mortal danger and panic set in. The officer walked back to our car and told Stacy to get out and follow him to his car. As she got out, she looked at me and Tracy, and there was sheer terror on her face. She followed him to his car and he motioned her to get in on the passenger side. She did. Tracy and I were crying, and as the armed men stood on the side of the car looking at us, we began quietly praying for God to protect the three of us. We prayed that Stacy wasn't going to be hurt, and somehow that would let us all leave. After some minutes, Stacy bolted out of the officer's car and ran back to the car, jumped into the driver's seat. She was crying hysterically. So of course Tracy and I began crying harder. The officer got out of his car and walked back to our car, this time to Tracy's window as she was in the front passenger seat. He asked, "Is it true y'all are in the Air Force?" To which Tracy replied, "Yes, sir." The officer calmly said, "Get out of here and go back to wherever you came from. I better not see you again." As soon as he finished, Stacy turned on the car, whipped it around, and sped back down the dirt road. She somehow navigated back to the highway. As she drove back toward the base, the silence was only broken by an occasional sob from one of us. Stacy drove for a while, and as soon as we crossed back over into Nebraska, she pulled over on the side of the highway. Then she began to sob heavily. Tracy and I hugged her and asked if she was hurt in any way. She quietly shook her head no, she wasn't hurt. After she calmed down enough, she told us what happened in the police car. After she got in the car, she offered the officer her ID and told him she was sorry for speeding. He took her information and then asked her, "What are you doing with those two N-words?" Stacy was white. She explained that we were on a road trip. He then told her that if she would do certain favors for him, he might let us go with a warning. At that, Stacy had a complete meltdown. I guess while he was waiting for her to calm down, he finally looked at her ID and saw that she also had given him her military ID. He asked her if we were all military, and between sobs she said we were. He asked where we were stationed, and she told him outfit AFB. He then told her to go back to the car. As we sat there after Stacy told us what occurred, I think it all hit the three of us at the same time, that the only thing that saved us was that we were in the military and stationed nearby. We hugged each other and cried until we could cry no longer. We didn't report what happened. Again, we were teenagers and didn't think we would be believed over a law enforcement officer. We never talked about it after that day. That incident has haunted me for years, all of the what ifs. But as I have gotten older, what haunts me more is the thought that others may not have been as lucky as we were. This story takes place around 3 years ago. I live in a very small town in rural Appalachia, southeast Kentucky, that is home to a lot of folklore, primarily around an area of my town called Westwood. To give a little backstory on the area and why it's such a hot spot, the hillside that Westwood sits on was a field hospital in the later part of the Civil War, wherein Union and Confederate soldiers were treated in the same area. So, the area is ripe with stories to tell. I dated a girl in high school that lived in Westwood, and being that my town's size altogether is a little over a mile, I used to walk to her house quite often. One night in November, we decided that we were going to walk downtown just to get a little exercise. The path that leads into town was once a railway that used to go through downtown, but since I've been alive, that rail has since been ripped up and paved over to create the walking path. It's around 11:30 when we leave. We spend a little time just sitting and talking in town before we decide to head back home. On the way back up to her house, we hear what sounds to be a bell ringing. We stop and listen, thinking that it was a flag bouncing off of the flagpole in the Confederate cemetery. But then it hits me. The wind's not blowing. She comes to realize that at about the same time, and we just look at each other. Then the ringing got louder and faster, so much so that people were turning their porch lights on to figure out what was going on. I've never run so fast in my life. We spent a lot of time in the graveyard together. That was our place to go and get away from everything for a while. A few days after this occurred, we started paying more attention to the graveyard when we came through and noticed a bell at the foot of a grave. Knowing that people were buried alive sometimes, and that bell was meant to be rung if they were falsely pronounced dead. It was the first thing that came into my mind. It also could have very well been someone messing with us, but something in my gut tells me that's not the case. Me and my cousin Elle were very close. We always did everything together and have been mistaken as twins a lot. We would always do sleepovers when we were teens, so when Elle invited me to her house, I immediately said yes. Once I got there with $30 from my babysitting, we headed to the corner store to stock up on snacks. My aunt trusted us as we were 13, and it was only a block away. When we got in, we noticed a guy about mid-30s in the corner just staring at Elle. We just ignored him and got our snacks and left. When we were walking back, Elle dropped one of the bags, so I picked it up and noticed a guy from the corner store walking in our direction. I thought it was weird, so I whispered it to Elle to not look back and just to walk to her house, which was across the street by this point. When we got there, we told my aunt and uncle, who were shocked, so they locked the doors and windows and put down the blinds. I opened the window because it was in the middle of a Michigan summer. Me and Elle watched Murder, She Wrote until I heard the faintest crunching of leaves in the front yard. I turned off the TV and told Elle to get her dad, who said it might have been a raccoon, but slept in the next room to us to be safe. At around 1 a.m., I woke up to Elle screaming and saw her being dragged out the open window by the guy we saw at the store. I yelled for my uncle, who came in and grabbed Elle and ran back outside chasing the guy. I grabbed Elle, ran upstairs and called the police, who then arrested the man. It turns out he had been stalking Elle for weeks, and he was planning on kidnapping her and had an entire collection of things he took from her and pictures he took of her without asking. I still lock all of my windows. When I was 10, I did scouts. My two best friends at the time, Jasmine and Ava, were in the same group as me. These scout activities were held every Tuesday from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Once we went on a field trip to an apple-picking farm. By the time we arrived, it was slowly getting dark. Thankfully, I had my flashlight. However, neither of my friends did. At one point, some of the kids started complaining that there were weird human-like bite marks on some of the apples. My friends were just talking to each other when I got the idea to see if there were any good apples on the trees. I went up to Ava and Jasmine and said, "Hey guys, I'm gonna go see if there are any good apples over there. I'll be back in a bit." I thought they heard me, but later it turns out that they didn't. I went up to the trees next to the woods, but all I saw were old rotten apples. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there, so I turned back around, and that's when I noticed a fresh bite mark in the apple that wasn't there before. That's when I heard Jasmine and Ava calling my name. I ran up to them and told them what happened. I even showed them the apple. We heard the motor of the tractor being turned on and looked back to see the other scouts getting on the ride. We ran as fast as we could, and while running we heard the sound of footsteps behind us, but we didn't look back. Once on the hayride, we all kind of looked back at the tree at the same time and noticed a tall, dark figure in the spot where we were standing just a minute earlier. Thank you guys for watching and listening to another scary story video. I want to be honest with you guys. I am in great desperate need of true scary stories from my viewers, my listeners. If you guys want content to continue to be created, you have to dig deep, share the channel with your friends, and jot down some stories. I don't care if the stories are 4 or 5 sentences long or 4 or 5 pages long. Anything and everything is accepted. I know you guys can do it. Until we meet again, stay sinful.